So a mysterious call from your future self basically indicates that you're going to be dying in a matter of a day or so. That's basically the story of One Missed Call. I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds.
Hello there.
So something that came up for me, a question is, like what is it that makes a satisfying ending to a horror flick? Because different times, I tell you, like, sometimes you have like something like that would be a quote happy ending, but it may not be necessarily a satisfying one, like kind of, and then J horror seems to, I think, always have a interesting kind of bent on this as well.
Yeah, no, definitely there's certainly not the happy endings too often,
Right.
and even the happy endings. I mean, would you call this one a happy ending? One Missed Call?
I don't know. I think that's definitely what we'll have to kind of look at again and stuff like that. So the first one, the Japanese version and everything, I guess we'll kind of get into it. There's these students who they like finding that their friends are kind of getting these calls and they're kind of getting killed off one by one and stuff like that. It's kind of, for me, it's funny because it kind of reminds me a little bit of Final Destination, even like kind of before we kind of get into like kind of the actual mechanics of the rules, if you will, for this series and stuff. And then of course when we talk about the American remake, we'll get definitely a lot more into like kind of you can really see the influence and stuff. The thing here, like the director Takashi Miike, I guess he
Miike? I don't know.
Miike. He definitely kind of seems to have an interesting range of like kind of stuff that's like kind of very violent and bizarre to like kind of stuff that's like family friendly, like so I don't know, like we kind of last time talked about kind of Gore Verbinski kind of have an interesting kind of range and stuff like that, so here's another one and stuff.
He reminds me a lot of, in some respects, of Park Chan-wook in that there's often a very kind of, there's some surreal kind of elements to a lot of his movies, and they often they have a certainly the ability to surprise you a lot of the time when you're watching them. And he does some very sort of interesting and sometimes funny concepts. Like one of my favorites is the I think it's called like the happiness of the katakuris or something, which is basically the sound of music but with zombies. And so and he also did sort of like IP Man as well, which is another pretty bizarre movie, and Audition, which are all really kind of, they're pretty cool movies, all very interesting. So I mean, I kind of put him in that sort of vein of people who were influenced or kind of on the border with David Cronenberg, David Lynch, all those kind of folks. So there's definitely influences of stuff and lots of surreal stuff. I mean, I think the whole Jawbreaker thing in One Missed Call is pretty surreal. It's pretty weird.
And the characters too. Like I tell you, like kind of like I don't know if I have to admit that I've only watched this, and then I've seen parts of Audition. I haven't really like kind of watched it all the way through and stuff like that yet. And in this movie though, like I mean, he's got some oddball characters, like the reporter, like kind of throws the kind of phone in front of this girl and stuff like that. Then the for lack of a better way to put it, like this death database guy,
I was going to mention him because I mean he's kind of like this kind of reclusive, long-haired kind of guy who's just sort of seems to just obviously like looking at people who've died recently. And then he just sort of, there's this weird, I mean, he obviously sort of has this pervert kind of vibe about it.
Right.
So you almost get this feeling like Takashi Miike has put this guy forward as a, some sort of person who's into this kind of thing. And then just sort of randomly starts taking photos of the protagonist. And then that was such a weird scene for me because he's there sort of like documenting her in case she turns up in the morgue.
Right.
And then she's trying to protect herself with her phone, which I thought was a really interesting kind of use of imagery there. Because she's trying to hide her face, but hiding it with the phone.
Right.
And that really stayed with me. I don't know if this is like some sort of analogy of people having like comment wars on websites or, those kind of tensions and stuff. Or, it was a weird sort of thing about online privacy or.
Well, I think what's kind of driving at too is like, since we all have cameras on our phones now, we do kind of use them more like almost a, weapon and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And
he doesn't ask her permission either. He's like just there, and it really takes you off guard as a viewer as well. It's a really weird scene. Yeah.
And I think it's definitely like kind of, almost like, and then it's almost similar to the reporter too, like where, he's thrusting the phone on this girl to kind of basically set up for this show and stuff like that. And then so it's kind of like, we kind of talked a little bit offline about this, about how like, it's just yet another one of those kind of reality shows, right? And stuff. And, kind of, and what's always funny to me, like kind of having actually been on some sets with these reality shows is that like, and certainly, I know that's probably not a real big secret stuff, but a lot of it is scripted and like, so it's kind of, to me, the joke is like to call it a reality show where there's definitely a lot of times for me, it seems like there's more realism and like kind of these drama where there's more authentic kind of feelings that like the actors have and stuff like that than, like kind of these reality shows where to me, it's like almost like bad acting and stuff like that too.
Yeah, and I mean it's very director-led as well. Like the what you don't see is you only see the edited 30 seconds where the response they've managed to. It may have taken them like an hour with the director going backwards and forwards, going, "So what do you think about that person? They took that away from you, and I would bet that would make me angry. Surely it makes you angry as well." And and then they can just if that sort of reaction is just a sort of like. Like that, they capture that, and then you put it right on the end of what someone else has done. You kind of, it's very manipulated, I think. But yeah,
and it's interesting how we talked a little bit last time, even or the past couple, that here again we have technology being kind of like this enabler for the supernatural. It's like we kind of went from VHS to like like what's called just different times, like these.
There's a bit of videotape and photographs in the Grudge.
Yeah. And then now, our phones aren't safe.
Yeah. Well, I've been thinking a lot about this actually, because obviously we've been watching a lot of J-horror and why they're so different. And for me, this is the real sort of difference with these is this idea of social or memetic horror. So basically before that, it was kind of almost like a moral judgment. You'd have a slasher movie where, because the teenagers are, having sex or whatever, whilst they're in this vulnerable state where they're carefree, that's when you get stabbed or whatever. And there's this sort of subtle, I don't actually think it's so moralistic. I think it's more playing on this idea of trying to find ways of frightening people when they're in vulnerable states. We talked about this with the Grudge and everything. But with this, I think with the social thing is, if you look at in The Ring, you have to have someone pass the video on to you in order for you to watch it. With The Grudge, you have to somehow get called to that house, and that's how this curse spreads from one person to the other. It's the social contact that actually brings you into that. And with this one, it's literally like your phone number, your phone addresses. Yeah. So this is this weird sort of thing of like, it's actually your social connections that are causing the attacks on you, which is not something you'd really seen in horror before, I don't think. And I think what's interesting as well is, especially the Japanese ones, if you notice, it's always the teenage girls who are the ones who know about it first and are aware that it's a curse. Now, this is one thing, because one, obviously women are often portrayed as more intuitive. And two, it's often like, in terms of social stuff, teenage girls are just way ahead in terms of technology. So they're kind of playing on both of those sort of things. And also there's the added bonus that they're probably some of the most vulnerable people in society as well.
That's true.
So it kind of hits on all of those sort of like notes, so to speak.
And also, it's a cliche or stereotype, but I think, like teenage girls is definitely some of the most social too. Like, it's like,
absolutely.
Like one of the things I still kind of remember, I'm trying to think of what, documentary, this or that, but it kind of talks about kind of where sometimes, like, even though like, we may have, like traditional bullying kind of being like guys and stuff like that, but girls different times, like the whole Mean Girls thing, I think that kind of really hits the note on how like sometimes it may not be like physically violent as, much, but like kind of it still can lead to like depression and suicide and all kind of stuff, because it's like this social pressure that the girls put on each other is like kind of almost, you know, really overwhelming.
Oh, it's ridiculous. I mean, it's like I see that with my 6-year-old already.
Wow.
You know, it's yeah, there's enormous sort of pressure that she feels to be like popular and liked and everything else. It's just nuts.
And I think, you know, like kind of technology, you know, as we often talk about, is an enabler of great things, but it's also, you know, definitely kind of makes it where there's this added pressure, you know, kind of to stay connected and kind of, you know, get likes and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
You know, I remember I kind of, you know, like the Black Mirror episode, you know, I'm trying to blank now. Nosedive. It's just such a telling, you know, like kind of, you know, portrayal of like kind of where we're at. Like kind of, you know, we are just, you know, really like one step away from Nosedive in reality.
But you know what? I think this is really reflected in horror. I've been thinking about this a lot as well after watching One Is Cool. Because if you notice, like horror movies up to the early 90s were all set normally around houses or factories.
Yes, right.
Mostly houses, though. You know, you always think the haunted house.
Yeah.
And I often think of this in psychological terms, in that, like, often when you dream, a representation of the ego is the house, right? Or people often dream about how their life is going as represented in a house. You know, you have a shack that's got holes in the roof. You're not feeling too good about yourself. It's a mansion. You're feeling great, that kind of thing. And I think actually these days, the reason why a cell phone can be the centerpiece of a horror movie is because our egos are actually far more tied to our technological fingerprint or our space online. And so the cell phone is actually, you know, it represents that sort of the same thing that a haunted house would, you know, in the 80s in a way. And I think that's the shift why horror is becoming more technological in that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like a joke in a way, but, you know, like different times you'll walk down the street and even like a homeless person, right, will have a cell phone. Like, you know, he may not have a home, but, you know, he's still connected and stuff. And so he you know, quote unquote exists then.
I mean, I just remember I was walking through like some really sort of poor district of, I think it was outside New York somewhere. And this was right in 2009, you know, we'd had like the big crash, loads of people out of work, but everyone still had like a newer cell phone.
Yeah.
I was like, you know, somehow people always seem to, but anyway, that's just an aside.
And the other aspect I think with this is that, like, you know, this, what kind of we've seen now, you know, between The Ring and Grudge and stuff like that, is something, you know, like kind of, it's something we haven't really talked about, which is why I want to bring it up. It's this kind of idea of hungry ghosts. It's this idea that, you know, this desire, you know, kind of for vengeance, or, you know, like kind of, you know, this hate or whatever is this echo that survives and stuff. And we kind of have that a little bit in Western tradition, but I feel like it's something kind of, I don't know, something very different. And certainly, like, you know, there's these festivals actually, you know, in Asia that are dedicated to kind of, you know, appeasing these hungry ghosts. Like it's kind of like Halloween, but instead of giving candy to kids and stuff, you're giving, you know, like kind of food and all kind of stuff to these, you know, to the Buddhist priests and like kind of, you know, and also kind of leaving it out to your ancestors so that, you know, the hungry ghosts are appeased and stuff.
Yeah, it's sort of like Day of the Dead in Mexico as well. They leave food as well.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way it's interesting, this idea of, I've been, you know, because we've watched quite a few now where you're kind of playing follow the ghost, and you're trying to find out what's the, you know, what's the deal, what does this ghost need? Right. And I think in a way it's a call of empathy for these ghosts. You know, the way they're treated is pretty bad. So basically it's kind of, there's this underlying message of reconciling trauma for these ghosts that were ignored in real life, and people are trying to kind of right those wrongs, or, you know, I guess it's, you know, it's just don't ignore your neglected or hurt people, or they'll turn into killer ghosts. But yeah, and then this idea that because we've seen that in both The Ring and in this one, that, you know, there's almost like this idea we have to reach out and kind of hug the bad ghost in order for it to kind of you know, stop being bad.
I think that's somehow a very much an Asian kind of, you know, Eastern thing of, like, that you have to really embrace the dead. Like I feel like in Western society, a lot of times that like when kind of people get on in years and stuff like that, there's almost like this kind of abandonment. If in fact, what's starting to become apparently a more trend in Asia is like this kind of thing of like that different elderly people are dying alone and stuff. I'll have to link to the documentary about it that I just came across. But you know, traditionally though, like you know, a lot of times, you know, like you have like kind of, you know, beyond the nuclear family, like different generations living under the same roof. That's a very traditional Asian thing. And but then we've over these, you know, with modern times kind of thing, whatever, it seems like that's kind of going away. You know, just maybe because it's not considered as cool or hip as much and stuff. And I feel like, you know, that embracing of like kind of a spirit like that is something that's very much ingrained into like the Eastern, you know, culture of that you don't just kind of abandon like kind of the elderly, like, you know, it's just something I feel like, yeah, it's like kind of very much I don't know, we've kind of definitely gone away from that. And I think that's like kind of a little bit like where to see this in a movie, I think shows how like that's still something that like is in the people's minds, that like, you know, like, oh, this is like kind of, you know, the way they were kind of maybe raised or, you know, kind of things. But at the same time, the reality is that like you know, that maybe part of it is like kind of between, you know, like kind of the pace of modern society, stuff like that. Some people would even blame like kind of, you know, American media, right? Because that's what's also portrayed is that like, you know, a lot of times you see like, you know, the elderly people or these kind of cranky old people that like you have to see and stuff like that. Like, you know, something like on The Simpsons, right, where they had to visit grandpa in the, you know, the home and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, I think there's also just a trend more to sort of isolating people anyway, regardless of COVID and anything else. You know, we're already kind of on the way to that.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of work and various other things sort of gets people to move in all sorts of directions away from family and everything else, because you just have to go where that is. So yeah, I mean, it's just an overriding trend, I think.
One thing between the remake and the original that does stick is that like you start off with like kind of these multiple characters that are getting killed off, but then in the end it narrows down to like kind of the one remaining friend and stuff like that. You know, like it's kind of like in the American, you know, quote unquote traditional horrors, like the final girl kind of thing, stuff like that. So here in the original, we have Yumi who's left, and then she kind of has to team up with kind of the dashing ex-cop. And it's interesting how in the original the cop is fired, but he's like kind of like you know, kind of, you know, has a very stoic kind of thing as we talked about, and he shrugs it off. Whereas the original, he's still a cop, but then he somehow, you know, seems to find the time to kind of, you know, have a lot of off-duty kind of.
He does, doesn't he? Yeah. When you think about it in those terms, yeah. I mean, I think as well, it's kind of a bit more. The detective role was kind of a bit more, I don't know, weirdly portrayed in the Takashi Miike one, because when you first see him, you don't really know who he is or what he's doing, and you just see him kind of unzipping a naked girl's dead body and putting his fingers in her mouth, and you're like, what the heck? And then it turns out he's a detective, and it's, you know, but and then also kind of there's this sort of weird kind of subtext of like, I'm just going to hang out with this teenage girl now, regardless of what happens, and then and then there's the weird thing with the ghost at the end of his sister and everything else. I didn't think they didn't include that in the US one, did they?
No, that's the thing that like, and that's another reason why we're definitely gonna need to kind of, you know, discuss like, you know, what's the deal with kind of the endings and stuff. So I think one thing worth mentioning is kind of it's interesting how one of the central things is like that the girl happens to be a psychology student, right? And then she's aware of like kind of this, you know, disease, Munchausen Syndrome by proxy, which is not like, you know, I mean, that's not like you know, OCD or like you know, ADD, or, you know, like kind of some you know, more generic kind of, you know, disease. It's kind of like this bizarre psychological thing of like where, you know, like a parent apparently will abuse a child or to get the attention. And like it's funny because I didn't even really know, like I've kind of heard of something about it, I guess, for some reason. And then in the one movie or the series rather, The Act actually is a recent Hulu series with Joey King that like they showed like kind of this girl who like, you know, for most of her life was like basically, you know, house, like, you know, stuck in the house because of the fact that the mom was constantly pumping her full of drugs to kind of have these appearance of you know, different illnesses. So it's definitely something that like I think is becoming more aware, but it's not like, it's by no means like kind of, you know, just your average kind of psychological kind of illness and stuff.
Yeah, it's a pretty messed up thing, really, when you think about it. Yeah. I mean, I thought that it was useful in the plot device of the original, though, because it meant that, you know, he thought was the bad guy wasn't, or bad girl, I guess. But that was pretty interesting. And I think as well there was, I mean, just on a kind of a random note, I thought there was this really interesting use of the autopsy rooms and toilets in it, because I don't know if you noticed, but like at the beginning when they're in the restaurant and they go and she goes down to the bathroom with her friend, you know, the tone obviously changes. It becomes more sinister because that's when the first phone call comes through.
Sure.
And then when they actually get to the autopsy, when they cut to the autopsy room, it looks almost exactly like the toilet, and you kind of think you're back in the toilet, but you're not. So, and it made me just think, I wonder just how many horror movies have people getting scared in toilets. And, you know, there must just be, the list must be like as long as there are horror movies, more or less. Because again, it's just like playing on, you know, places where we're supposed to be safe and you know, but we're potentially vulnerable and all this kind of thing. So.
And I wonder if that's like kind of, you know, like a driver for like why women will, you know, like, you know, I know there's
always go to the bathroom together, right?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it makes you wonder. Yeah, and I think there was also kind of some other thing of like one of the girls one of the first ones that receives the call. You know, there's another girl who's sort of criticizing the fact that she's kind of leaving the lecture and is about to go and hang out with this guy, and she's like, oh, she's so carefree now. Like, you shouldn't be that. And of course, then she dies. But the other thing I was going to say was, even though this was quite a long movie, the original Japanese one, it moves along at a fair old click. Yeah. Because, you know, within 13 minutes, you've established the rules and you've pretty much had the first killing. And the US one takes quite a lot longer, I think.
That's true.
I think it takes a good sort of 20 minutes. I mean, but the US one is shorter, which is interesting, but it kind of feels longer because it's worse generally. But the other thing I did want to mention, which I thought was really interesting, was this idea of the severed hand dialing the number.
You're right.
Because
that was definitely memorable.
It's memorable, and I think it's kind of almost. I think that's actually a comment on how people are so unconsciously connected to their devices. It's like you see people just like going like this on, you know, on the tube or something, and it's like there's so little kind of. It's so instinctive that we've got this connection to our devices. So I thought that was a really interesting image.
Definitely, and I tell you, you know, like. The things that kind of really stuck out for me besides that was also how you know, it's like each time, right, that like you kind of know or you kind of have some kind of hint that the what's it called, how the death is going to happen in some way and stuff, and then yet like they still like kind of, it's all about the setup, right, to kind of line that up and everything. And I'm kind of curious how they came up with the times, because like, whereas, you know, with The Ring, you had the 7 days thing and stuff like that. Here, like kind of, you know, like it's kind of, I don't know, the ghosts apparently have this kind of arbitrary kind of, you know, deadline kind of set up each time.
Yeah. I mean, that was kind of interesting. But it was clever the way it was done. I really like the idea that you're hearing, you know, yourself in the future. You know, that was a really, and again, they're sort of playing with death and spirituality as a time distortion. You know, like The Grudge, you could see ghosts of your daughter or stuff like this in the future, and this, you're kind of, you know, you're hearing yourself in the future as well, which is kind of, again, not something often seen in a lot of other horror movies, or certainly not Western ones, where you see them sort of playing with the idea of time being connected to otherworldly things.
I feel like kind of, you know, like maybe part of that is like the influence of, you know, Final Destination, where, you know, like kind of that was part of the whole gimmick too, right? Where it was all about like kind of that some kind of premonition of the how the, you know, death is going to happen, and then like it's all about kind of each time lining things up, so, you know, kind of, you know, having this bizarre kind of, you know, death happening and stuff like that. And then like that reality show. So the exorcism,
that was
like kind
interesting.
of like it felt very much like we're on the one hand, like we kind of knew that like she was going to be doomed anyway, something like that.
Oh yeah.
And we kind of knew how it was going to happen in the sense of like, you had this image of her in terror and stuff like that. And yet like, like I think what was for me, like kind of stood out about it was it definitely had to feel like kind of some of these Japanese kind of, you can't even really call it reality shows. They're kind of like these almost like game shows and stuff like that. Like
like Takeshi's Castle.
It just kind of felt like, had that kind of feel to it. Like everything's kind of bright and kind of, very much surreal until like everything turned dark too. That's what I think was interesting too. That like kind of, that like it was almost like the power had to be switched off to kind of, create the whole, I don't know, the crank up the horror, I guess, aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, that was really interesting for me because normally, you kind of, you often think in these sort of movies, you think, oh, surely if the supernatural exists, then there must be someone who kind of can understand it and provide some sort of insight into what's going on. And I thought what was good, this was almost a bit like the Poltergeist, but kind of taken in a weird direction in that you had the psychic turn up to help up, but it was just a kind of very empty kind of media exploitation of the situation, which was a really interesting kind of spin on it. And it was kind of interesting, but a little contrived how they lost all the power and everything else, and I think that was the most violent death probably in the movie. I would have thought in the original one.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, maybe like felt like kind of the ghost was kind of like knew that it was on live television, kind of. Exactly. So it was gonna make it kind of flaunt its kind of powers, I guess, so to speak. And it's funny how like the girl was so like she was convinced that was her salvation and stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, I almost feel like in a way that's like a statement about how sometimes we put our trust in the media and like where because it's the media, so therefore like kind of this like the authority, I guess, right, that is kind of given to the fact that like they're the media and everything. And I feel like that's kind of in a way what's kind of being portrayed in that like that even though like a lot of times, as we know when we talked about with reality shows, that like it's all a sham and stuff, and and certainly like kind of this reporter slash kind of show person had really no, I mean, on the one hand he kind of like put on this appearance of like kind of really like, oh, we want to save you and this and that, and I feel like that's almost like kind of like the sometimes what we see too with these shows and all that, where the media person basically puts on an image of like empathy and care and stuff like that, but meanwhile I think for me like what was striking was like kind of the creepy smile that like that he had, and I almost feel like that kind of symbolizes kind of the real lack of empathy at different times, that like it's just put on as a show, like kind of that very much like this kind of sociopath kind of tendency we've talked about as well.
Yeah, but there is this idea that she was so into going on the reality show because we have this feeling like if we broadcast our problems, they will somehow be validated,
right?
And what you kind of expected was after this this girl gets killed live on TV, you kind of expect after that must be crowds of people in the streets and sort of saying what's going on, the ghost's real and everything else. But no, and I think that was very, very telling actually of the kind of cynicism that this kind of thing would create. Actually, is quite a realistic take on it. I think people would just be very skeptical, and it would probably get shoved under the carpet after you'd seen it, I'm guessing.
Yeah, it's funny how like he made it a real point to show how like maybe you're I want to say that was a term that is one of those definitely it's kind of like the equivalent of Times Square, like kind of I think it's Shenzhen or something like that, like one of the commercial areas and stuff like that. It's kind of known. Yeah. And they show like kind of the show on one of those huge gigantic screens and stuff like that, and people just kind of going about their business and everything. And I think you're right that like it's very much like just portraying how people pretty much are just going to just basically just be going on. Like, and I feel like in a way that's a reflection of the difference between, like, say 40 years ago or something like that, like kind of where if you had, like, granted they didn't even have a screen that big, I think, but like if something in the 50s or 60s happened like that where people could see it, they would like just be frozen, like kind of watching and stuff.
We're so sort of saturated and don't trust anything we see or trust anything we want to see, basically, or what we want to read. So
or maybe that's the kind of the other price of access, that we have so much access now, even on our phones and stuff like that, we kind of go, I'll watch it later, like kind of.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing, we had a sort of a continuation from The Grudge a little bit, in that she's, rather than just getting the message, as the third victim, she actually takes that kind of selfie video. So again, you have like the monster being sort of videoed, and you have to, and we as the audience get to scrutinize it on video before, whereas in the other ones, really, you don't get a good look at it maybe until right at the end. It's sort of similar to this, but you get to see the creature a bit more in this one, but or the ghost, whatever. But yeah, it was just interesting to see that again used. There was actually a lot of this movie that I kind of felt it was meta referencing lots of other Japanese horror movies. It almost felt like it was a collection of a lot of the things from other ones.
Well, there's the shower scene, right? So that definitely echoes kind of The Grudge.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it felt kind of almost like a kind of a fanboy film about J-horror in a way. But it was interesting to have. But I mean, again, it was quite a surreal turn to have the detective, the way we get introduced to him, but the reality show and the psychic was quite a weird turn for a horror movie. And then third, like the database guy was another, again, real kind of like left turn and all this.
So I think we've got to talk a little bit more about the ending before we transition. Again, as always, major spoiler and stuff. And so here, like, it seemed like everything kind of, was a happy ending, so to speak, where, the guy ends up with the girl kind of thing. And then what the F, like kind of, like where all of a sudden it turns out that she's possessed by the spirit of the actual, sister that kind of, has been doing all this stuff rather than the mother. And so therefore she like, is going to basically, Munchausen the heck out of this guy, I guess.
Yeah, that was a really unexpected turn. It was just really unexpected when you see him hugging, and then he just looks down and there's the knife in him. And I just found that smile at the end where she's just sort of got him in the bed and everything else was just like, that was pretty creepy.
Because that's the other thing too, that like, it wasn't her intent to kill him too. It's just to intent to like basically put him in the hospital, like kind of, so that's kind of, like, and like, so apparently like he's like, I don't know, like he loves her, so he's gonna stay with her. Like, I mean, that's almost like seems a little bit like what they're hinting at. But like, I'd be like, what the F are you doing? Get the hell away from me.
I think having been in a situation not totally unlike that before, you tend to keep your mouth shut until you see an opening when you can escape, and then you'll go for it. That's a story for another time, I guess. But
that reminds me, like, kind of Misery, like kind of, like where that's a character who really had to bide his time. So
absolutely, yeah. No, I mean, I think it's funny that your instinctive reaction is not to sort of challenge the person who's willing to go that far, but just to keep very quiet and try and just sneak out at some point when you can.
Oh my goodness.
But that was quite a departure. But that was another scene a bit like the one where they're holding up those cell phones, and there's almost like this sort of cell phone war of like what is actually trying to be said in that part. And I'm still kind of mulling over that, to be honest. I don't know if you had any kind of insights. So what do you think he's trying to say there with that sort of ending?
I just feel like that it's kind of like a more traditional horror kind of ending in that, like, you know, that like in the end, you know, like kind of you know, there are no happy endings in horror. I think that's like kind of basically, you know, like when you get down to like, you know, it's like, you know, just if you look at any of the 80s horror, like kind of just the whole gamut, right, and stuff, that like something seems like kind of, you know, the rosy ending and stuff, and then Freddy comes back, right? Or like Jason kind of, you know, isn't really dead, you know, like kind of the sound of, you know, Jason comes along. Or Halloween, like kind of, you know, there is no body. So like there's this constantly kind of this thing of like, you know, oh, but like kind of, you know, part of it is like, you know, the joke is that at least it opened for sequel, but the other part of it is like kind of that, like it's kind of like you can't even call it a trope. It's like kind of just like the tradition, I guess, if you will, of horror.
Of course. Yeah, it does make you think, though. His sister was a bit of a dick, right? Because his sister purposefully stops him from sort of like having from stopping her having the reconciliation moment with the mother. And she's like, no, stop, because like everyone has their own time and everything like this. Had he gone in and stopped that, she probably wouldn't have been possessed by the daughter and could have potentially lived a normal life. And so could have he. In fact, his sister kind of doomed him to this life with this rather messed up woman who repeatedly stabs him going forwards.
Right.
So that kind of, I don't know. I don't think his sister would have wished that on him.
Well, yeah, I hadn't thought about that aspect of it. And yeah, I mean, that's the thing that's also interesting, right? Like where, you know, the chain, you know, like kind of starts back with like, we don't see the connection, right, between him, you know, and his track and stuff like that until like they finally somehow, or she ends up in the police station and he overhears like kind of, you know, like her talking about it. And then he makes a connection. Aha, you know, like kind of this is like, you know, what happened to my sister. And then, you know, like as they trace things back, then they see that, you know, oh, it was all connected to the sister and stuff like that. So I think that's another interesting aspect. I'm trying to think. I guess they definitely jumped to that conclusion. And I guess maybe now's a good time to talk about it. The remake. The remake is pretty much, it's not so much a shot by shot copy of the original, but it pretty much hits all the major kind of, you know, checkpoints, I guess, so to speak. And then, but I feel like we see the connection of the detective a lot sooner. And and I guess part of it is maybe that they wanted to kind of get them together sooner or whatever, and kind of, you know, go from there.
Well, it's half an hour shorter for starters, so they had to kind of get on with the story. But yeah, it does seem like there's more. There's a lot more of the film is just the teenage girls kind of trying to figure out what's going on, whereas opposed to this, it's kind of more of the detective and the girl.
Right.
But yeah.
And then,
I mean, for me, go on.
No, I was gonna say, I mean, you know, the striking thing, of course, is, you know, and again, as always, major spoiler, is it's a very different ending. You know, like kind of, you know, instead of like kind of this, you know, thing of you know, like kind of this messed up, you know, kind of possession and stuff like that. Here, they just outright killed the poor guy. You know, like kind of, you know, so I guess I don't know, like, but meanwhile though, like, the girl is saved though. Like kind of, it's kind of weird, like, you know, that.
Well, the girl is saved because she has the reconciliation moment with the mother, and the mother kind of like comes and gets the sister ghost thing. That was what I got from it. Yeah, I mean, it's in a way, you know, what I kind of liked about the original is that it ends with a very dysfunctional relationship as the ending point, and this is going to go on from here, and that really reminds me of Old Boy. Because at the end of that as well, you've kind of got this relationship that is really, really messed up, and like, where do you go from here? So you have that similar kind of vibe. Yeah, in the remake, they just kind of opt out and they go for the kind of the semi-happy ending where at least one person is spared from from the fate of it all.
So I guess that's a little bit why, like, you know, I asked, you know, when we started off about, like, you know, like, which one's kind of like the happy ending, and which one's the satisfying or more satisfying one?
Oh, for me, definitely the original is the more satisfying. Okay. Yeah, just because it was just an unexpected turn. It kind of felt like the end of something, but also the beginning of something else that was also quite messed up as well. So I liked it. It had a very kind of, it has a much more sort of satisfying cyclical kind of nature to it,
right,
than the remake, which is kind of like, okay, maybe if you're scared, you can sleep better at night if you're, you know, female. But I mean, apart from that,
right.
But I mean, for me, it wasn't very scary, the remake. It was like at every turn, there was loads of CGI, you know, lots of weird kind of people who looked like puppets, which you later on realized, oh, they're the puppets in her room. And, you know, the occasional millipede and strange sort of burning people. It was just so over the top, you know, there was nothing. The original had so much more subtlety. You didn't really see much. All you saw was like that one image on the phone, you know, the grainy kind of like LCD image. And that was about it. Everything else was just like chain links breaking or things coming out. But I mean, even the original though got a bit kind of weird and CGI towards the end. And I'm assuming the mother was all kind of prosthetic effects, because that didn't look anywhere like CGI, just looked like a. But yeah, all the kind of, I didn't really like. If I could change something about the original, it would be like taking out the weird CGI wind that kind of blows people around. There was lots of that, and
I see.
Yeah, that kind of ruined it a little bit for me. But but I didn't find the original very scary either, really. I just enjoyed it because it was kind of an interesting story and a bit weird. And I enjoyed it more because it felt like it was just referencing lots of other J-horror. The remake was, that was tough to like. It just seemed a bit like Scream or something like that.
I mean, you know, like I'm trying to think of any other kind of remake that we've done that had we've had some low Rotten Tomatoes rating, but this one has a 0 approval. I mean, like it apparently wins a Moldy Tomato Award.
Yeah. I mean, also, I think it was just very poorly directed as well. Like, it often felt like there were just two actors reading lines, and there was no real. They didn't seem like they were talking to each other. Right. A lot of the times, it's like I'm focusing on this person and she's reading her lines. Now I'm focusing on him and he's reading his lines. They just didn't. Yeah, it didn't seem anywhere near sort of realistic in the people's performances, and some of the reactions as well. Like, she didn't seem very terrified, really, or scared at a lot of what was going on. She just seemed so determined to find out what was going on, but didn't. There wasn't. And I think as well, the way that the tension was built up in scenes just wasn't effective. It just was not scary at all.
Shannyn Sossamon, I've seen her in some other, work. So she's definitely a very capable, actress. And Ed Burns, also like a very capable actor. Yeah. But I agree that you really didn't see that from their performances in this movie. No. And so, I have to agree that then it's got to be like kind of, just the direction kind of, and I think partially the writing where it's funny because on the one hand, you had clearly a bigger budget and where they spent on the effects and stuff like that, and it's definitely very much I don't know, compelling, but it's memorable in some ways and stuff like that, the mouth and the eyes and kind of thing, stuff like that. But yet it doesn't really add anything to it. That's what's funny about it goes back to the thing that sometimes with the CGI and all that kind of stuff that it could be almost a little bit just distracting. And I felt like different times that's kind of more what it did was just serve as a distraction and less as kind of something that kept the story going and stuff like that. I don't know.
Yeah, it felt more like a sort of a murder mystery with supernatural CGI thrown in rather than an actual horror movie.
Right.
Because it just felt so sort of by the numbers in terms of the direction. I don't know. Yeah.
And it's also a thing of that I on the one hand, I still felt like that they did some things well in terms of that they did kind of keep things moving, and that I thought was that was done well, I think, and stuff like that. But what did you think of Ray Wise though as the reporter in this case and stuff?
Oh right, yeah, he was okay. I always like watching Ray Wise ever since Twin Peaks. I've got a lot of time for Ray Wise, so yeah, no, I enjoyed him. I mean, he was actually one of the better performances, I thought, because he was just slightly creepy and what you'd expect from him. Right. So that was quite good. Actually, the weird thing that I noticed, because I in the flashbacks to Beth's mum, I thought, when I was looking at her mum, I thought, who is that? I really, she looks really familiar. And I don't know if you realize, but that's Laura Harring from Mulholland Drive.
Oh, interesting.
And in, I think, an uncredited role.
Oh,
in
I didn't know
movie,
that.
which was really weird because she looked so familiar.
She did, yeah.
But she looked a little bigger than I remember. I don't know if she put on weight or something. But it was still definitely her. But
right.
Yeah, she was obviously not on screen for very long. But that was kind of a weird person to notice in there. Most of the rest, I did sort of like, because I was kind of bored by the movie, I started Googling the rest of the cast, see what they've been in. And the other interesting one is that Ariel Winter is Ellie Layton, who is, if anyone has kids, she's the voice of Sofia the First, the animated Disney princess that got cancelled a few years ago. But so she's done lots and lots of musical numbers as Sofia the Princess, which I thought was quite funny. But yeah, aside from that, it seems like a lot of the others have been in horror movies. But
I didn't even realize that she's actually also like one of the Dumfies from the Modern Family series too. So I totally and that's a series I actually really enjoy and follow stuff that too. So that's interesting how that kind of like totally skipped me as well.
Yeah. No, I mean, aside from that, it just felt like they tried to sort of just throw in random images of creepy things like puppets. And I mean, I did kind of like the woman with the two mouths for eyes. I thought that was kind of a cool thing. I mean, that's obviously what they've got on the poster.
Right.
And the weird thing is, by putting that on the poster, you would expect it to be kind of like a Cronenberg-style body horror movie or something like that. But it's just obviously nothing like that at all. But it's quite an attention-grabbing image anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what they were driving at with, doing that and also like kind of just the different things was that like the people were starting to see things that kind of was like, that they kept, like kind of making them turn and stuff like that. And I guess that was one key difference, like with the original, we really didn't see what the characters were seeing. And I think that's what, like kind of the remake was trying to show us, right? And again, this kind of gets into the thing of like, is showing us really something that kind of, adds to it. I mean, I can kind of see in some ways that like it was something that kind of, was very eye-catching and stuff. But I mean, I just, maybe like, is that goes that thing though, like, did it really add to it or,
No, not for me anyway. No, it kind of detracted from it. I just thought, oh yeah, look at that. They've tried to make that look creepy. But I mean, what's interesting for me is that like this whole thing of noticing something out of the peripheral of your vision and how the director portrays that is very different in this movie compared to others. In this one, it's kind of like you get the full-on image of something, and it's very obvious what you're trying to look at, and they're trying to sort of scare you with it. In things like, say, Halloween, it's done in a very different way in that there's just like, Michael Myers is almost completely stationary, and you see him, and then next minute he's gone. And there's like there's no movement, there's nothing. It's just like he's there and he's gone. And then like in The Grudge, they had, these very kind of subtle shadowy things of the girl moving across a mirror or just briefly in a reflection, or you see Toshio like in the reflection of a door and then the door closes and it's gone and things like this. It's done in such a more subtle way, and I think that's just so much more effective. But it also depends on where it is within those scenes as well, how we've spaced it out, because a lot of those things, I think they've had the character by themselves and they've had time to kind of, you're watching them, think about what they're doing, and there's this kind of quiet area where you've had a chance to be as introspective as the characters are in that scene. In this, you didn't have that time. It was like, I'm getting on a bus, oh, there's a puppet, and then on to the next thing. It was like, you need to sort of bring your viewers into that kind of quiet space in order to make those subtle kind of subconscious things effective, in my opinion.
And I think, like it felt like each time it was the characters looking right at, whatever it is and stuff like that. Whereas a lot of times in the other, like you said, how it's done in these other ways is always like out of the corner eye. So it's kind of like subliminally makes you think about like, that the person is really second guessing themselves, like, did I really see that? Like kind of versus like, okay, it's right there in your face and stuff like that. Like,
Yeah, I mean, in this one, it was like, oh, look, there's a millipede crawling out of that person's eye.
Yes.
And it was sort of just so kind of obvious. It kind of lost. Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? It's kind of, you can't relate to that in a way that you can of someone
right.
second guessing that imaginary thing. Yeah, you're right.
Because like a lot of times, I mean, I've certainly experienced it sometimes, like, when you're walking along and something kind of catches your eye and your mind kind of plays this trick of like, did I really see that? And you kind of have to look back. Like, I think just that, motion, like kind of, and what's funny, I think, is that like, and I don't know if you knew this about how like in flying different times, you're taught to use your peripheral vision because it's actually, there's something more precise about it though, that like,
interesting.
So like, when you do like what, you say that you're flying at night and stuff and everything's darkened right in the cockpit. And so what you're taught is that like to not stare at your instruments and stuff, because never mind the vertigo that can happen and stuff. But the idea is that if you keep your scan going, that then you're using that peripheral vision that's more crisp and more accurate in different times.
Interesting.
Because I think it's like, it has to do with like kind of our,
like internal filters or something like that. The way we kind of, if we focus on something, we start to kind of like.
I think it's also
information.
It's also like kind of from our, like ancestry, whatever, that like, our reticular focus, whatever stuff activation is about, like kind of looking for things and stuff. And so our scan normally, what saves us, right, like as a species, was like the things that we caught in our periphery. So that's why that's always been like kind of the sharpened, kind of that it kind of catches our attention more readily and stuff.
You get a quicker response time from your peripheral vision, perhaps. Maybe then if I'm trying to sort of like beat some old arcade games that have really high response times, I actually get a really big screen and just have my peripherals so I can actually see the stuff when I'm playing shoot 'em ups or something. But,
right.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff. Yeah, it is interesting, that connection. And I mean, I think as well, it was just so over the top, so brightly lit, everything was so visual and in your face. It was, it was hard to get scared by it, to be honest, which is never a good thing for any horror movie, I would say.
And also I think horror has this, it's again, not even balanced where like, that like on one hand you want dark because that tends to like kind of, like a lot of traditional horror, the darkness is like kind of what, and the shadowiness of things is what really kind of helps to accentuate like kind of the mood or like kind of, make things, heighten, like that we're looking for things out of periphery and stuff like that. And so meanwhile, like I said, when you have it brightly lit, it really kind of takes away from that. But at the other hand, though, like, you don't want to have like kind of the Game of Thrones thing where like, everything's so dark that people just kind of go roll their eyes and kind of go, what the F?
Yeah. Especially when you turn up the brightness and you realize that, you're seeing all this macro blocking on your streams from HBO or something. Yeah. Anyway, first world problems. Yeah. So I don't know. Any further thoughts on One Missed Call? I thought it was a really cool concept. Don't get me wrong. I thought both were actually a really interesting idea.
Yes.
And I didn't actually feel like either really executed it really to the maximum scary potential. But I did enjoy the Takashi Miike one.
I have a feeling that like, 10, 20 years from now, there'll be another remake and, maybe they'll get it right the next time around. But
2 missed calls. Yeah.
Alrighty. So coming up, we're going to be talking, of course, as we discussed offline, is we got Pulse and Dark Water. We definitely will be kind of rounding off our J-horror month with these. And I mean, certainly the other thing that we kind of come across is that there's definitely plenty of horror movies that like have multiple remakes, and we'll be looking at those at some point as well. So once again, I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds, and we will catch you next time.